Joining, we're going to get started here in just a moment. All right, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to today's event from the Council on Criminal Justice. I'm Stephanie Kennedy, the Policy Director here at the Council. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar exploring recent trends in shoplifting and retail theft. If this is your first time joining a Council on Criminal Justice event, welcome. The Council was founded to advance understanding of the criminal justice policy choices facing the nation and to build consensus for data-driven solutions that enhance safety and justice for all. We are a think tank and an invitational membership organization, and we are guided by the belief that a fair and effective justice system is vital to democracy and a core measure of our nation's well-being. That mission has driven our members and staff to take on some of the most pressing and high-profile issues in our field: the impact of COVID-19 on our criminal justice system, reform of law enforcement policy and practice, violence in our communities, and racial disparities, just to name a few. Today, we explore another high-profile issue in our field: the recent trends in shoplifting, smash and grab episodes, and organized thefts by mobs at retail stores, which are driving headlines across the country. We aim to examine what the data show and don't show, and get clearer about whether these crimes are increasing and whether they pose a threat to the safety of shoppers and staff. Given that many retailers have implemented additional anti-theft measures, and some have changed when they report shoplifting to police, we also want to address how these changes may have influenced our understanding of the crime. In November, the Council produced a report on trends in shoplifting to inform the field and inform deliberations of our Crime Trends Working Group, a group of expert producers and consumers of criminal justice statistics, seeking to explore and explain current crime trends, while building consensus for significant improvements in the nation's capacity to produce timely, accurate, and complete crime data. Today, we'll hear from one of the authors of that report, CCJ Research Specialist Ernesto Lopez. We'll also hear from David DeVillers, partner at Barnes & Thornburg and chair of the Ohio Retail Crime Task Force, as well as Nelson Bunn, the executive director of the National District Attorneys Association. So thank you for joining us as we explore what's driving shoplifting trends and dig into what we know and don't know about this increasingly visible crime and discuss strategies for improving data collection and transparency. Before we begin our program, a few notes. To ensure a quality experience for everyone, all lines are muted, but we do want to hear from you. Throughout today's session, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will take as many questions as possible at the end of today's session. Anyone with questions we don't have time for can email us. My colleague will put our email address in the chat. If you are a member of the media, I ask you to please identify your outlet when you submit your question. And with that, I welcome Ernesto Lopez to provide an overview of our shoplifting report. And we're going to share a link to that report with you now for you to review in detail later. Ernesto.
Hi, thank you, Stephanie, for doing some table setting and providing an overview of what we're going to discuss today. As mentioned, I am one of the authors of this report that I worked on with Bobby Boxerman and Kelsey Kunda from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Next slide, please. So just as an introduction, Council on Criminal Justice has been tracking crime trends since 2020, really with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and social unrest. We continue to track various crime trends, including violent crime and property crime, drug crime, for a sample of cities, which is very similar to what we'll be discussing today. This is also a very important, timely topic because of increased media attention and government attention, as well with hearings in the House and also state legislatures. It's important to notice that our report focuses primarily on shoplifting, and we do that for a variety of reasons, mostly because there are measurement challenges that I'm sure we'll get to today. But I just also want to share the FBI definition of shoplifting, the theft, which is the theft by someone other than the employee of the victim of goods or merchandise exposed for sale. This is really important because it is limiting, and it's not an investigation if something eventually becomes organized retail theft or something else. It helps separate this between burglaries. So this is a fairly narrow definition, but we use that because it enables us to really get a count of one specific offense. And we do talk about other offenses a little bit throughout the report, but I just want to highlight we're looking at reported shoplifting, and this is the definition we're sticking to. Primarily, the data is used from 24 cities that look at incidents by month from 2018 to June 2023, which is when we stopped collecting the data. The other data source we use is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is a effort by the FBI, and that includes nearly 4,000 law enforcement agencies from 2019 to 2021. While 2022 data are available, they weren't available at the time of the analysis. Next slide. So here, when we look at the average reported shoplifting rate in 24 cities from 2018 to the middle of 2023, we see that there's some clear seasonality, that it increases and decreases through the summer and when, different months throughout the year. But what you really notice is this major decrease around March of 2020. That coincides with the COVID-19 pandemic and various lockdowns. You start to see an increase throughout going into the summer. Again, gets to that some seasonal changes with activity. But the main thing to take away from this graph is that the average shoplifting rate across these cities is not at pre-pandemic levels. Again, this is reported shoplifting. So while there's been a more recent increase with these average rates, the average rate is still below pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. Now, when we look at the overall counts from the first half of 2019 to the second half of 2023 by city, we see that the majority of cities are still experiencing decreases. They are still below these pre-pandemic levels. Some major exceptions are New York, Los Angeles, Virginia Beach, Dallas, and there's a few others that have increases. Next slide. Now, oh, sorry, there, thank you. So when we look at the total number throughout all these cities, we see that there is a 16% increase in 24 cities. So adding them all up, this is what we come across is from the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2023, there is a 16% increase. However, much of that increase is driven by New York. Again, New York's a very large city, so it makes sense that New York does have a large influence, but their influence is sort of disproportionate to even their city size. So when we exclude New York, you see that there's a 7% decrease. That's not to say that New York isn't important or we shouldn't consider it in the analysis, but it's just to highlight how one city is really driving these overall counts. Next slide, please. So we also looked at other offenses to see if shoplifting follows the same pattern as other types of larceny, vehicle theft, robbery, burglary. And what you find is really before the emergence of the pandemic, a lot of these trends move together, and they're all indexed, basically have the same starting point as January 2018. These crimes occur at different levels, at different rates. So this is just a way to get a visual comparison. And you can see from the beginning of 2018 to around the March of 2020, they move together. You get the drop with the pandemic, and with the main exception of motor vehicle theft, which we cover that in our other crime trends reports. We're not going to get into that here. You do see, and again, this is for New York, this specific graphic. You do see that shoplifting begins to deviate from some of these other trends around 2021 and remains higher compared to some of these other trends. Next slide. Just to highlight a few other important findings from the study, the median value of stolen goods and shoplifting incidents grew from approximately $75 in 2019 to $99 in 2021. The share of felony shoplifting incidents nearly doubled from about 8% prior to the onset of the pandemic to almost 16% in the first half of 2023. More than 95% of shoplifting incidents in 2019, 2020, and 2021 involved one or two people, and about 98% of shoplifting incidents do not coincide with another offense. For example, assault, either simple or aggravated assault. And lastly, store assaults were about 8% higher in the first half of 2023 compared to 2019. The store assault is not assaults that occur within a shoplifting incident, but just occur within a store. And next slide. And again, we're going to have plenty of discussion, but I just want to highlight a few key points. We acknowledge that shoplifting is underreported like many other crimes, but it is a remaining question if a change in reporting, whether that is a change increasing or whether the change is more reporting, which would result in increasing offending, even if offending doesn't change, or if there's decreasing reporting, even if offending doesn't change. So that is a major challenge we have when trying to sort of identify the actual trends. It's also important to consider that there's the difference between incident and harm. We looked at the value of shoplifting goods because if you look at counts, if someone shoplifts something worth $5, that's still one incident compared to $500 or $5,000. So it's important to start to get at that question. And also, while we discuss if trends are going up or down, it's important to keep in mind that this informs a conversation about policy priorities, that there are limited resources and that there are some states such as California that are dedicating large amounts of money to these issues. And so it's important to have a really good sense of the data and a good sense of the trends so we can make informed decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ernesto. I'd now like to invite David DeVillers to provide insights from the retail industry perspective on recent trends in shoplifting and retail theft. David. You are muted. Has to happen once.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so we really got started with the Ohio Chamber of Commerce in June of this year, and it was more based on. I would agree that crime statistics, at least in my opinion, tend to be dubious. Even the FBI crime statistics. In my prior life, I was a U.S. attorney in AUSA for a couple decades. But what we looked at and what got the impetus of what we were doing was a survey of businesses showing in Ohio that 62% of businesses said that crime, not just retail crime, not just shoplifting, is hindering their ability to expand business. And that was high. And so because of that, the Chamber of Commerce decided rather to start kind of a task force or think group. And we got together with merchants, with retail, with transportation industry, with federal and state law enforcement, and with the kind of local county prosecutors. And we're still, trying to figure out what's really going on. I don't think the sky is falling. And I do agree that, a lot of this is an uptick based on COVID being over. But the one thing that I kind of look at is, all right, why is it that, and I think it's absolutely true that retail is concerned about this, and whether it's perception or whether it's reality, they're definitely concerned about it. And I don't think necessarily I've heard, that they're blaming their losses on this because, they're looking for a scapegoat. I just don't think that's a motivation. I think most, presidents or CEOs, their shareholders don't care, how they're losing money. They just care that they're losing money, and they need to figure it out. Also, I've talked to a lot of kind of the high level individuals within retail that deal with loss prevention. And the thing they told me was their biggest concern of retail is their competition with online selling. So that's what they're concerned about. And the biggest reason for people to go to brick and mortar store as opposed to buying something online is that shopping experience, right? And initially, I was told, it's anecdotally, but it's pretty universal, was that there was kind of an effort to minimize, I've heard the term suppress, the idea of retail theft and the smash and grabs and some of the violence has nothing to do with retail theft within these, malls and stores and shopping centers, because they wanted to have individuals have that good shopping experience. So just something to think about when you hear them complain about it, because it can hurt them even more. And then even more so is you'll start seeing these situations where you have a bunch of makeup is a big one, and razors locked up, in drugstores and other places because they're concerned that does not help the shopping experience that they so desperately need. So that's just kind of what we've been hearing the past, 6 months or so. And I know this is about shoplifting, but even within retail theft and organized retail theft, and what I mean by organized retail theft, I mean is not stealing the candy bar to eat it, but stealing a bunch of candy bars to resell. All right, and not so much candy bars, and there are different ways of doing that. Often it could be from the warehouses that are bringing goods to stores. It could be on a transport. It could be in the back room of the retail store. It could be through, and I think quite a bit of this is through, inside jobs. But even within shoplifting, does shoplifting mean necessarily that I'm taking it out, maybe even with, organized and clever ways, using boost bags or other ways and walking out the door, or does it also count? And what we're seeing is the registers, right? So the person at the register is in on it, if you will. They work there, and person they go and they buy, $20 worth of items, but are walking out with $120 worth of items. So is that shoplifting? And then of course, what happens with these retailers, it rightfully so, it's like, all right, here's our loss. And here's our loss due to damaged goods. But where's the other loss coming from? And which of those things is it coming from? And how successful are individuals that are able to get the items out of the store? And what I look at, so I look at all these things, right? And the one thing that grabs me most is, where's it going, right? Is there a reselling or fencing, if you will? And how is that? And why, if at all, why is that increased? And I think the reason you see is it's easier now, right? It's easier to do it either on, I'm in a big condo, and every day, hey, I got something for sale. Then there's online sales. There's eBay. And I'm not picking on eBay. I think, from our conversations with these eBays and other online sellers, they're doing a lot to try to stop this, right? They have a vested interest in not getting shut down by the government. So they're doing a lot. But then there's, sales in the dark web. There's one of the first boosters I mean a professional kind of thief, as an AUSA about 10 years ago, we kept seeing this one number being called by, all these kind of drug dealers, this conspiracy we're doing. So of course, we dig into that, and it doesn't appear she is selling drugs, but we later find out, and she comes in and she talks to us and she proffers, and she had a massive $1 million, $100,000 a year business being a professional booster. And by that, I mean, she had a connection of individuals that would call, hey, I need a Gucci bag. Hey, I need a watch. Hey, I need this. And she had a group of individuals that would go around and had this market, right? She would be doing this without the market, but had this relatively organized market of people that need to deal in cash as opposed to credit. And also, don't want to pay retail. So this is what she did for years and years and years. And, I learned a lot of how they go about doing that. And I mean, she had like rules that she lived by. And one of them was, if you're the person leaving the store with the merchandise, you always buy something.
Okay.
Right? You always go through the register. If she knew somebody that was part of the scheme that were in there, all the better. But if not, you always got to buy something on the way out. And again, I just want to, I think all of these items, whether it's traditional shoplifting, whether it's inside job, whether it's transit, whether it's warehouse, the thing I think we need to concentrate on as citizens and as law enforcement and as retail is the selling after it's stolen. And I think that's kind of the answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. It's such a valuable perspective, and I hope that we're definitely going to dig into that as we have our discussion. But now I would like to turn to Nelson Bunn to provide some insights from the prosecution perspective. Nelson?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to the council for convening this panel discussion today. So on behalf of NDAA, our members are elected, appointed, and line prosecutors around the country. And so we're in communities daily seeing firsthand what these businesses are encountering on the ground, trends in various crimes, et cetera. David started out with talking about sort of the reporting, and, Ernesto talked about it as well. I think we do have to be mindful of the reporting and the data that's coming in. I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit more as we get through this discussion, but understanding, what those reporting trends are, how law enforcement, local police departments, working with prosecutors, working with local retailers, are able to really track and report these crimes in a way that reflect the reality on the ground. Certainly we know that police departments around the country are down a lot of staff. And so, that likely plays a role in this as well. From the prosecution perspective, just this week, there was a hearing on Capitol Hill that our incoming president testified at on organized retail crime, retail theft. I know we are talking about shoplifting in the context of your latest report. And it's really important to differentiate the candy bar being stolen, the formula that a mom needs for, her child, which, that's in a category of its own versus some of this more organized and habitual theft. Our members on the ground are certainly aware of the broad scope of the problem. And when, back in September, our members did a lot of store walks directly with retailers and stores around the country. And some of the stories and numbers were, extremely eye-opening in many ways. One retailer that had a cargo ship of 600,000 pairs of jeans on their way to South America. Obviously, that's different than the shoplifting, and I think it all kind of gets conflated and sort of put in the same bucket. But that's why data is important to really help look at all of this. But at the end of the day, because prosecutors are charged with providing their communities with public safety, we see all of these stories on the news of smash and grabs that you mentioned, Stephanie. And, there's a real sense from the communities at large that the issue is on the rise. We would agree with that perception in many ways based on what we're seeing in communities. And I think that while in some cities data is showing one thing, we do have to be careful with sort of what that reality is on the ground, what's being reported, the non-pursuit policies, rightfully so, by retailers, and then the lack of resources by police departments and prosecutor offices. I know we'll get into some, tools that we may want to be available. I think from the prosecution perspective, making sure we have all of the tools we can use to address this problem, particularly in an environment and marketplace where, a county line doesn't deter an individual from traveling. An individual store doesn't deter an individual from stealing in multiple locations. So making sure that we have the tools to do that is also really important. And I know we'll get into a lot of these issues. So I want to keep my sort of opening comments short so that we can get into some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Nelson. And we've got questions rolling in. And so please, audience members, keep them coming. Again, if you're a member of the media, please identify your outlet and your question. I'm going to do a moderated discussion now. We'll have a kind of open forum for audience questions later. But as things are coming in, I'm going to try to weave them into what our kind of moderated discussion will be. So I have questions for each of our panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Ernesto. So why might the data you presented showing shoplifting at levels lower than they were before the pandemic stand in contrast to many of these viral videos that we're seeing about the smash and grabs and mobs of people kind of storming into stores to steal items, and these really brazen incidents, some of which have resulted in serious injury or death to workers, law enforcement officers, and bystanders?
Yeah, I think that's a really key and important question. But I would also say that a report doesn't necessarily stand in contrast with the data. We just need to put these videos in context with the data. To illustrate a point, let's say, just again, just to illustrate a point, that there were 2,500 viral instances in 2022. That would account for 1 out of every 100,000 reported larcenies, burglaries, and robberies in 2022. Again, that's just for illustration, because not all robberies are business, not all larcenies are shoplifting or store related, but just to try to put into some context within numbers. With that said, that doesn't diminish the seriousness of these incidents or the harm to the victims. These are real crimes with real victims. We've heard about recently that news in Philadelphia. That is not to diminish what occurs, and those are incidents that should be dealt with in accordance with the law. Nevertheless, it's important too that we understand the actual scale of the problem in the U.S. and really try to get a grasp, as has been talked about here with data. And so it's not to diminish, but we need to contextualize.
Thank you very much for that. And I think it's a really important point that we need to really be thinking about both the incident count and the kind of like quality of these incidents, quantity and quality. And now I'll turn to you, David. What data do retailers routinely collect about retail theft, including shoplifting, burglary, fraud, these kind of stories that you were telling about someone on the inside helping folks as they're coming in? And what characteristics are collected on these incidents? So are there data about the value of the total items that are stolen, the number of people who are involved with that kind of offense, whether there is an inside person, that sort of thing?
Very little. And as Ernesto pointed out, it's also regional, right? Like what's happening in one city might be completely different than what's happening in another city. And it's difficult, particularly because of the nature of retail theft, particularly let's say out of store theft and shoplifting. Very few of them get caught. I mean, it's not a bad gig in a lot of ways. It's a fairly low yield, low risk, high yield reward. Well, low risk, low yield, depending on how good you are at it. But it most of these are either misdemeanors or low level felonies, unless you can build some sort of like conspiracy or what we call RICO sort of corrupt activity sort of conspiracy based on aggregation, like how many stores, how many times, how many victims, and try to add that up, which is time sensitive and difficult for prosecutors and for investigators. So that what they look at, what retailers look at really is not so much, they look at the FBI statistics and the state government statistics and like Ernesto's statistics. They definitely look at that stuff, but what they really kind of look at is loss, right? How much property is missing any given day, month, year. And some of it's from damage, some of it can be from rain, but it's also from theft, and what kind of theft and how many people did it. It's hard to tell.
Gotcha. Thank you for that clarification. And so to you, Nelson, we know from victimization surveys that not all crimes are reported to the police. For example, Ernesto and his colleagues found data from one major city to support very low reporting rates among some retailers. But these data also indicated that reporting to police had changed over the last few years. So have you seen reporting practices changing recently, either increasing or decreasing? And what do you think might be influencing those changes?
Yeah, so I think we have seen in many ways reporting go down, which is why some of the data points may paint a different picture than what we are hearing directly from practitioners in the field. Some of that, I think it's a confluence of factors, to be honest. Some of it is resources within the law enforcement community. Some of it is the ability or lack thereof in the retail industry space. When they have a security officer, in-store personnel who are there, and they see one of these, major incidents that we're all seeing on TV, the no pursuit policies, they don't want to get their staff in harm's way, which is understandable as well. As we pointed out too, we've seen a lot more violence associated with it as of late. And so I think that also, that's where you may see start of an uptick in reporting, because as you hit into felonies, as opposed to maybe misdemeanors, as well as physical violence to individuals, you will see more reporting than maybe, you know, when somebody comes in and is seen on camera walking out with a bag of goods. I think in our partnership that we have with the Retail Industry Leaders Association, we've seen firsthand that the partnership has probably increased communication and collaboration in a way that, I mean, ultimately, we hope we see an uptick in reporting to make sure that we have accurate data, to make sure the resources are there, to make sure that we have a full scope of the problem. And we've seen firsthand when we're working with retailers and our prosecutors every day, that collaboration has drastically increased. And there are a lot of concrete examples where folks are getting on the same page, they're putting the necessary resources in place to address any upticks in their communities. And so it's an ever-changing landscape. And I think that we'll maybe see if you know, look back 3 years from now, what does the data around now look? Are we able to show that more concerted efforts have been beneficial? And so we hope to sort of continue that and make sure that we're able to provide those resources and training and other educational awareness issues for our members in working with retailers to make sure we have as accurate of a picture as possible. And historically, law enforcement and isn't good at data collection. It isn't good at data reporting. We can get into some other issues around that capacity of offices. Smaller offices don't have the infrastructure, the case management systems, the capacity. So that's a challenge too when you get into reporting that, you know, certainly has to be considered in this context.
Yeah, I definitely hear the need for increasing the training and infrastructure in the retail space. So regardless of whether things are being reported to the police and maybe captured under that very narrow shoplifting definition or kind of other larceny in the FBI stats, like identifying a way for retailers to really show the scope of the problem is, yeah, a great place for you and your organization and your partnership organization to move towards. And so, Ernesto, to continue our discussion about reporting, what kinds of data would we need to identify the portion of shoplifting that is due to this kind of lower level stealing crimes that have come up here, stealing a candy bar, stealing formula for to feed a baby, versus those who are in really organized groups, right? Who are stealing, kind of stealing for a living to determine and to determine whether these folks are operating locally, whether it's national, whether it's transnational. What might we need to do that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is sometimes that distinction could be kind of tricky because someone could be on the border of both or may move from one group to another at different times. So that's the first sort of general thought I would have with that. But on the first level, I would look at the value of goods stolen as probably a fairly decent measure for that, right? As has been sort of mentioned here, that, you know, if someone's using something for personal consumption, most likely it's going to be a smaller dollar value. But that would only tell really part of the story. The main thing we really need is better, I think, prosecution data. It's a major challenge in criminological research. Criminologists and other researchers who study the criminal justice process from arrest to sentencing to release really struggle with that area with prosecution data. So I think, and really to answer this question, we need to actually move beyond just individual incidents from what maybe the officer would see to actually cases that are built, and again with prosecutors. I think because then we're moving from, again, it could be something as simple as shoplifting, and the data may not as simple, I won't phrase it that way, but it could be just that definition I shared are for personal consumption, but it gets lost if it's actually for something you know, in a grander scheme of things. And we need to get data at that next level in order to really help make that determination. There'll still be gaps, but it is a step forward.
Thank you. Because, like, as I understand it, shoplifting and larceny, kind of broader theft, are reportable in the FBI data. But organized retail crime is a decision made by a prosecutor, right? It's not something that's cataloged in the same way.
There is a measure called stolen property offenses, but it's really vague. And when you look at the numbers, I don't really know how much that captures it. if it's already questionable enough to use, maybe shoplifting or burglary. So we'd probably need to look at that measure maybe more to see what it captures. But you're correct. Right now, that FBI data is really limited.
Okay, thank you. Now, David, back to you. It's worth noting how even a decrease in overall shoplifting incidents likely would not diminish the way the public perceives the really scary events that we've been talking about, the things that we're seeing out on, in the media that are happening on the streets. And so even if these incidents aren't comprising the bulk of retail theft, what are you seeing in Ohio? And are your local trends representative of what your counterparts in other states are experiencing?
So I don't think we're seeing as much of the kind of the smash and grabs as you're seeing in some of the other states, in that there isn't this organized, running into 30 people running into a building, smashing stuff, stealing stuff, and leaving kind of in this massive, quick conspiracy sort of thing. But we are seeing a lot of violent crime and other incidents that aren't necessarily related to theft in our malls and stores, and we have a lot of shopping towns. The Easton Town Center is huge here, and you see violent crime, shootings, and that's the nature of large areas where a lot of people gather to some extent. But it's also the nature of, I think, violent crimes in a lot of cities that are increasing. You're going to see those in the retail and merchant sector as well. I don't see an increase necessarily in robberies of these stores. That is coming in. Smash and grab could be a robbery. I mean, it's force or threat of force. And you come in with a hammer and smash some glass and steal something. There's kind of an implicit threat of force. But again, we don't see an increase necessarily in robberies. We're seeing an increase in loss of merchandise, and we're seeing an increase in violent episodes in and around retail that are, again, hurting that shopping experience, especially this time of year, right? You want people to go to the malls and go to the town centers and go to stores. And if they're concerned, especially, perhaps at night, when stores are staying open, that they're going to see, a drive-by shooting or a fight or anything like that, they're less likely to go.
And to follow on to that with a question that came through in the chat, like, how are retailers trying to increase that perception of safety in a store, given that violence is happening, maybe not in the store, but kind of in the shopping environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a good time to be in the protection industry as far as security goes. I know there's a massive increase in some of the cities regarding special duty, which is when police officers can make some money on the side. They're actually, they can call the police. They're in uniform, but they're being asked to go to events, stores, banks, shopping centers. So we're seeing an increase in that. And that's one of the ways to do it. Of course, what's that do? That still drives up prices.
Right. Thank you.
Hey, Stephanie, can I add a point on that?
Of course.
So I think too, we're sort of in this conundrum of when you ask about sort of the perception and what retailers are doing. I think the same applies in the context of prosecutors and law enforcement, in that that you've got the issue of capacity for collection of data, but then the data that is there, do you want data that shows the problem is worse? Because then does that serve as a sort of deterrent for shoppers? Same thing with the prosecutor's office. Do you want to show that, there's a big push for data transparency in the prosecution world? Data is a great thing. It helps with decision making. But, do you want, what if you were in a retailer's shoes or in a law enforcement agency's shoes, saying, well, violent crime or X, Y, or Z is up this amount, has sort of that deterrent effect. So in some cases, we have to be sort of careful about, when we're talking about this. I think all of the stakeholders in question want to make sure everyone is as safe as possible. Consumers, the rest of the community. So data is good, but does data hurt you in some ways too? I think that will only help us ultimately, though, when we talk about the resource issues and addressing the root causes of some of the challenges. But I think we just have to think about it too in the concept of, does greater incident of thefts then sort of reinforce some of what we're seeing in the media? So.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, that it's really complicated for retailers who want to get clear, but also don't want to create more panic. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm going to stay with you for another second, Nelson. And so, as we've heard here, a concern of many lawmakers and retailers is that stolen items are being sold on online marketplaces. And a kind of parallel concern of many community members is, having packages stolen from front doors and communal mailrooms. So how do you feel like this online marketplace really figures into retail theft from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we certainly know, David referenced eBay earlier, and I would agree, eBay tends to be one of the better platforms in terms of the measures they have in place. But when you look at like Facebook Marketplace and Amazon, more times than not, the goods we're seeing on these platforms are likely stolen, or when they're heavily discounted, it's extra product that has been picked up somewhere. And so we're probably all complicit in purchasing things that may have origins that are not what we would all want. At the end of the day, though, I think technology and the openness of the marketplace these days, and the way we all shop, and the way our consumer trends are, sort of lend itself to supporting the third-party marketplaces. I think measures in place for identifying goods that are counterfeit or that are stolen, we can always work to enhance those measures, and I think the marketplaces need to do that. Some are better than others, which we see with technology companies across the board. Some are also harder to get information from for investigative and prosecution purposes. You get into issues like encryption and Electronic Communications Privacy Act issues, where you're trying to get information and maybe a judge has signed off on it, but the tech companies say, no, we're not going to give it to you. Well, that factors into this context that we're talking about today too, because all of this information is building blocks. It's toward that investigation and prosecution. And so, it's all about relationships. Expanding communication and relationships is important. But the marketplaces are a huge problem that I think is only going to get worse, and we're seeing it grow. And so a lot of attention needs to be put toward it, in addition to the local community smash and grabs and others that we're talking about.
No, thank you for that. And to kind of follow on to that, and this echoes a question that came through from a reporter with CNN Business. We're seeing this online marketplace, potentially driving this retail theft that we're seeing. But we're now also seeing images of everyday items like dish soap and deodorant being locked up. And so how do basic goods and kind of these everyday items, I think David mentioned, like razors and toothpaste, like how do these things factor in?
I mean, I'm happy to start, and if David then wants to sort of chime in. So it's this merry-go-round that we're going to get on here, in the sense that as more and more goods are locked up, that feeds the perception that things are unsafe in many ways. Additionally, though, we have to think about communities that are historically underserved and underrepresented in ways that you take a store that may have more and more locked up, it becomes more and more of a hassle to get basic needs. Then you have families that end up suffering from not being able to get some of these items. You have to be mindful of that. A store then closes. We've seen a lot of news about stores closing due to theft and other issues. Well, maybe that's the only store that had groceries nearby in addition to other services. Then you have a food desert. And so I think we have to be mindful of all of that, which is why it's really important that from a prosecution and law enforcement perspective, that we're working with our retail partners to identify the issues where we can intervene and we can prevent, to hopefully get to a place where it's as open of a consumer experience as possible while also embracing, modern technology. But we want communities to feel safe going shopping, and retailers want the same thing. And so I think we have to be mindful of the appearance. And prosecutors are mindful that every single day as elected officials and appointed officials that they are ultimately accountable to the communities they serve. And so that's why I think it's really great that we're working with retailers so well in this space, because we're able to come together, identify those common challenges, but also lift up those common successes and identify solutions for it.
Thank you, Nelson. And David, do you have anything to add, since this is your terrain?
Yeah, I think, he's absolutely right. You may have one store in one town or even neighborhood that's looks completely different. Same store, same franchise, and completely different in another. And it's because stuff's getting locked down. There's more security cameras. There might be more special duty people. All that costs money, right? So it's not just think about it. It's not just the money it costs to put in these locks and secure sort of areas. It's also the money that you have to pay extra people, because you need people to leave the register to go and lock this stuff to service their customers. And then more expensive for protection, for security, for surveillance, for nighttime surveillance. So it adds up. So one store in one location, maybe making a bunch of money, and then the other store, they're making a lot less, but it's in a community that needs it. And they're making a lot less because of all the other things they have to do. So it's an issue, it's a problem, and you see stores closing down in areas that probably, need those stores more than others.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to stay with you for another second. Do you have a sense of how much money retailers are spending on security and anti-theft measures, and how this might have changed over the past several years?
I haven't seen any good statistics on that, either local or national. I'm sure. I don't know where Ernesto would probably answer that better than I. I haven't seen anything specifically that addresses that issue.
Gotcha.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's nothing in the crime data, but I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But we do acknowledge that could be a challenge with the trends.
Gotcha. Thank you to you both. And to stay with you for just one more second, David, there was a recent retraction from the National Retail Federation that may have caused some confusion about kind of the scope of the problem. And that had to do with the share of theft attributable to organized retail crime, but not that total volume of theft. And so we have a question from a reporter from CNN. Do you know if there's an estimate on what percentage of retail theft goes underreported?
I don't know how you do that, right? I know what he's talking about as far, or she's talking about in regards to the inaccurate, like massively inaccurate statement regarding retail theft. But it's hard to, again, the only thing we can really do as far as looking at retail is the amount of loss, subtracting damaged goods, right? Yeah. So we don't know if it was stolen necessarily from the warehouse, from inside job, from traditional sort of shoplifting. You just don't know, because what percentage doesn't get caught, right? So you subtract, maybe you can subtract, or we made this many arrests for this many stores, yet we're missing this much merchandise that isn't damaged, and try to do some math on that. But I've not even seen that.
Gotcha. And following up from this, the National Retail Federation retraction, what do you think the industry could do to help the public better understand the extent of the damage from shoplifting?
Hire Ernesto. Actually have someone come in and actually read the data, understand the data, and not misspeak.
Gotcha.
Because credibility is huge when it comes to this. And I think that particular incident really hurt the credibility of that it fed into this narrative that they're trying to blame people for losing money, when it's really coming from online shopping. And it's unhelpful to the cause to say, hey, look, this is a real problem we need to address.
Gotcha. And Nelson, I'll come back to you. So your organization is working with a retail industry group to address retail theft. So can you tell us a little bit about what success for that initiative and other initiatives like it might look like, and how you'll know that you've achieved success?
Sure, happy to. So As I mentioned earlier, we've been partnering with the Retail Industry Leaders Association on this national partnership to promote safer communities. And it's really focused on relationships and communication, bringing together retailers and prosecutors and law enforcement from around the country to lift up those successes, identify common challenges, and then find solutions forward. In terms of what does success look like with the partnership, there are too many examples to give from a daily basis under this partnership that we've seen, but success, for example, could be a retailer and a prosecutor's office who may not have really had a good relationship or a direct point of contact, knowing that, hey, this is my asset protection person that I'm supposed to go to when we have issues, and we can work to solve these challenges we may face. So it's building blocks of those relationships and communication. Another example is making sure that policies and procedures are followed so that a prosecutor's needs for prosecuting a case, or PD's needs for investigating a case, that retailers are providing what they need. Vice versa, that prosecutors are being transparent with the retailers about what they need to move that forward. So part of this too is providing training. We referenced that earlier, providing resources. Most prosecutors' offices do not have a dedicated prosecutor to retail crime issues. A lot of times it falls under an economic crimes unit, maybe a felony or a misdemeanor unit in a smaller office that sort of is a catch-all. But at the end of the day, prosecutors are also starting to dedicate more resources and also collaborating in a way that sort of puts those building blocks together more for a successful investigation and prosecution. And so those are just a few things that we're seeing every single day in the conversations we're having with our own members and retailers. And we're really seeing it make a difference. And the collaboration as a whole, I think ultimately is going to provide for safer communities, and also bring in, we have this new Vibrant Communities initiative that I think at the end of the day, bringing in social services, law enforcement, prosecutors, retailers, that we address the issues of substance use, any kind of mental health challenges, the unhoused, but then hold those bad actors that are more organized and sophisticated, hold them accountable, and we can do both at the same time.
Thank you so much. And so as we are coming to a close now, I want to turn to some of our audience questions. So a question came through from a reporter from CNN. And I'm going to turn to you, Ernesto, first. Is there any indication that criminal justice reform, so like bail reform or changing felony threshold levels, are driving higher shoplifting?
So that's a little difficult to answer because the studies that have looked at bail reforms and other sorts of reforms don't look at shoplifting specifically, but the closest one would be larceny. And there was a recent report study done that looked at bail reform in New York compared to other states and did a pretty sophisticated analysis. So not looking at trends within just New York State, but comparing New York State compared to other states. And what they find was that there was no significant difference with bail reform with larceny compared to other states. So again, that was a fairly well done analysis. But again, it's a lot of the challenge with a lot of these reforms too, with measurement, is the research can't take them all into account at the same time. And so we really try to piece a lot of the evidence together, but on balance, the evidence does not support that these reforms have necessarily led to increases.
Thank you. And I remember a few years ago reading a report from the Pew Charitable Trust that found no evidence that larceny had increased in the states that had raised their thresholds. And so, yeah, I think it would be interesting and kind of a measurement challenge to figure out how to tie criminal justice reforms specifically even to larceny. Okay, another question that came through from a community member. Would you agree that retail theft was higher before COVID than it is today? Or do you think the data are so unreliable that we can't even draw that basic conclusion? And I think I'll start with Ernesto and then go to Nelson and David.
Well, I think when we look at the data, whether it's not just shoplifting, but all property crimes, let's say, just to simplify, excluding motor vehicle theft, I would say yes, it is lower because of just that big decrease of opportunity, right? Now again, it is tough to say with that. The major challenge I'd actually would have is, what we know with a lot of property crime is that there could be displacement, right? So maybe people pre-pandemic or even online, instead of selling goods at like a swap meet or something, did they now shift, right, to online marketplaces? So without really knowing if there's been a shift or an increase, we could see an increase in online, right, online market sales, but does that correspond with in-person decreases? So that's a major question I would have as well with the data. But based off of the data I see, I would lean towards no, but I could not answer that definitively.
And reporting is certainly a challenge here, right? If retailers are reporting differently, if it's decreasing or increasing, it's going to create noise in that data, correct?
That's correct. That could, but again, it's tough to say why would there be. It's not like we're looking at a very large time span of why there would be such a change so immediately, and that change really corresponds with a lot of decreases in overall property crime with COVID. So, you have a general change in just, I think, opportunistic behavior. But again, I can't answer it definitively, but I would lean towards most likely not.
Great. And then David and Nelson, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'll turn to you each. So David, can you tell us what policies we could implement to address retail theft?
Well, I think the only real way for law enforcement to have any sort of impact is to go after the organized retail theft and fencing. So getting rid of the market, going after the receiving stolen property, and aggregating these truly organized enterprises that are stealing, are doing this. And what I mean by that is using conspiracy, racketeering, and aggregating costs. You may, and also this kind of, in a lot of states, including Ohio, quite frankly, the organized retail theft kind of falls into cracks in that, Nelson can tell you, like, there's districts or counties, and they try to stay within their county. When you have, and what we're seeing is a lot of individuals going from county to county to county, right? So it's not one particular law enforcement agency investigating it, not one particular prosecutor's office prosecuting it. The U.S. Attorney's offices can get involved, but less so unless it's going to be, in the millions and crossing state lines. So I think that one of the things I think we should look at, kind of like Medicaid fraud, where you have the Attorney General or a designated state investigative body, like Ohio State Patrol or something along those lines, are the people that are assigned to investigate that as a state as a whole or as a region as a whole, as opposed to individual compartmentalized counties.
Great. And instead of turning to you, Nelson, we just got a really great question in the chat, so I'm going to turn to that. So even if most shoplifting does not involve violence, doesn't it affect people's perception of public safety, especially the brazen mob incidents?
I definitely think perception's reality, and I think we all have experienced that. So whether it be a violent incident where someone is injured or unfortunately we've seen, killed in some instances, or just the brazen nature of, individuals in multiples coming in and, literally cleaning off entire shelves, it makes us all sort of second guess when we're going into a store, because I don't think any community is immune to that necessarily. And so it certainly doesn't help the perception, regardless of whether there's actually a violent act that is included in something we see on TV, or just the nature of everybody getting out of the way while a group sort of runs out with bags of stuff. So, I think that we're still in that mode of something has to be done. And I think David mentioned aggregation. I think that's really important to mention. Not every state has the ability to aggregate across offenses and across counties. And so we've seen state AGs create task forces. That's one tool. Aggregation statutes would be super helpful. Mentioned RICO. Just a couple months ago, Miami PD had a months-long RICO investigation, working with the local state attorney and the state AG's office. They estimated about $20 million in loss this year from that ring. And it was, a dozen people at least. And that was through RICO. And so I think all of those tools are really helpful. And the more tools in the toolbox, then the better we can combat this.
Thank you for answering my policy question anyways, Nelson.
Yes.
So we are at time. If we did not get to your question, do not despair. You can email us. We're happy to continue the dialogue. Thank you so much, Ernesto Lopez, David DeVillers, Nelson Bunn, for spending this time helping us understand what we know, what we don't know, and where we should go next. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you at our next Council on Criminal Justice webinar.